In the mid-1880s, the Russian iron and compound armoured battleships built for service in the Baltic had been a little bit on the smaller side of things, largely because they were only thought to be needed to counter smaller nations' vessels in the relatively confined waters of that sea. As such, the next ship to be laid down was also going to be relatively small. But then everything changed, and the Fire Nation hadn't even attacked yet. The order was updated to reflect a much larger vessel more akin to the British Trafalgar class then under construction. The specification was now for a battleship that could operate to, quote, in all European seas and having sufficient coal capacity to reach the Far East. The need for this sudden change is not entirely clear. One Russian source indicated that the Russians had gotten wind of the Germans building a new class of battleship, but the German Navy only started considering building something so large, the Brandenburgs, in August of 1888, which was 2 months after Admiral Shestakov urged a change to a larger design. Who knows, maybe he had spies. The new design called for a ship just over 350 foot long, but with a beam limited to 67 feet to allow the vessel to be serviced at the Konstantinovsky dock at Kronstadt. These dimensions, and the planned armament of 4 12-inch guns in a pair of twin turrets, one fore, one aft, 6 single 6-inch casement guns in the superstructure, 3 per side, 14 single 47mm and 12 single 37mm guns, along with 5 above-water torpedo tubes, each carrying a single torpedo plus a reload, would give a planned total displacement of just under 9,500 tons. But, as with a number of her predecessors and successors, design changes came thick and fast after the design was supposedly finalised. A 6th torpedo tube was added to the stern, the conning tower's armour was increased in thickness, and the speed requirement was upped by a knot, to name but a few. As a result, she completed at a fraction over 10,200 tons, thus significantly overweight, and massively contributing to her long build time. She'd been laid down in May 1890 and launched relatively quickly in late October 1891, but the alterations, along with some poor quality boilers that needed replacing and fixing, meant that her fitting out took so long she only commissioned almost half a decade later in the summer of 1896. The ship was powered by a pair of 3-cylinder vertical triple expansion engines driving 2 screws, with a total of 9,000 indicated horsepower. The 4 boiler rooms each had their own funnel, which meant that the ship presented viewers with a grid of 4 funnels, just ahead of the ship's only mast, much to the undoubted delight of the men assigned to the fighting top and lookout position that was mounted there. This also gave the ship the nickname Zavod in service, which in my terrible Russian means factory. Protection came courtesy of a mixture of compound armour, which covered most of the protected portions of the ship, and new nickel steel, which protected the turrets. The belt was 16 inches at the thickest point, trending down to 14 inches and then down to 12 inches as it extended further fore and aft, and was mostly submerged thanks to the ship being overweight. The gun turret's superior metallurgy meant that they were only 12 inches in thickness, and the conning tower, which had been a source of a good portion of the additional weight, finally came in at 10 inches thick. The main reason for the difference in armour materials was that the Russian armour factory that was contracted to provide the ship's protection forgot that it couldn't make the necessary curved gun plates with gun ports cut in them at the thickness that was required, and so they had to make a quick emergency order from a factory in France. The French at this time, of course, being well ahead of the curve when it came to steel manufacture, so they were able to both make the turret's armour and to supply it in a superior material. Despite having been designed to defend the Baltic, she wound up in the Mediterranean shortly after commissioning and was then sent on to the Far East to help deal with a Boxer uprising, finally winding up back in her original intended posting in 1902. She was then brought in for a refit, which would include new rangefinders and radio equipment, which would be needed to engage past a couple of thousand yards, only for the Russo-Japanese War to break out whilst this work was in the final stages of being completed. Thanks to the refit, she was considered to be relatively up-to-date in equipment, if not necessarily in hull, and so she was sent out with the 2nd Pacific Squadron in late 1904, where she was assigned to the 2nd Division. Thanks to a literal fog of war, and very few survivors, exactly what happened to her at Tsushima is not as clear as it could be, But it seems that she drew into action a little bit later in the battle as the ships ahead of her were ground down by the Japanese Navy, and she was then heavily hit, flooding aft and having to stop to shore up bulkheads, during which time she may have been hit by Japanese Navy torpedo boats, but what is definitely known is that she did actually manage to mortally wound one of the attackers in return. If she was hit at that point, it can't have been too bad, as she was moving again shortly after midnight, only to then run into a series of mines that had been chained together and then dropped in her path. 2 of these mines then exploded alongside the ship, and she rolled over and sank very quickly. Between the speed of the sinking and the fact that it took more than half a day before any survivors were found, there were only 3 men left from a crew of almost 450.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.